We are recording.
Okay. Welcome to the 13th appointment with the cycle of special lectures on vernacularity and women between Asia and Europe. This year, so this is the second year of the second series of special lectures. And today we have, as our very welcome guest, we have Richard Tran once again. This time he's speaking from the University of California at Berkeley, so he's connected from the beautiful state of California and from the Bay Area, as he told us before. Richard Tran is so his full name is Richard Quang Tran. Did I pronounce well, Richard?
Yes.
Thank you. He's presently a scholar in residence in Berkeley's program in critical theory, specializing in queer studies with a focus on Vietnam and the Asian context. He has held research and/or visiting positions at the National University of Singapore, the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Ca' Foscari University of Venice, Italy. So he was with us for several years. He's a board member and treasurer of the Vietnam Studies Group of the Association for East Asian Studies. Richard will be intervening today, will be presenting today a lecture entitled The Modern Vernacular, Woman and Gender Categories in Vietnam's Early 20th Century. Richard, welcome once again to this series. We are so happy and honored to have you also among the other guest professors and scholars of this second vernacularity series. And I'll give you the floor. So thank you once again.
Okay, thank you, Vicenza. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see the slide, the screens?
Yes, Richard.
Okay.
Possibly a bit wider, maybe. I don't know. Just for me.
Okay, let's see. How's that? Is that better?
Well, I see it smaller, but maybe it's me. I don't know.
It's smaller.
Let's hear from the students. Yes, it's smaller.
Okay, let me try to make it.
Because maybe you have to share your screen.
Hold on, let me.
Not just.
Okay, let me. How about that? Is that? No? Is that better?
It's basically the same, Richard. Probably the best thing is that you share not the window, but the entire screen.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, okay. Now I don't even see it. Give me 1 second. Start then. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be here today. I would like to thank the Eurasia Foundation for sponsoring this lecture series. And at Ca' Foscari University, I would also like to thank the staff, Camila Ziani, Francesca Valloni, for their support, and any other staff who may be working behind the scenes to support the event. And a special thanks goes to Professor Vicenza Di Urso for the invitation and for organizing the lecture series. So to help orient us, this is the Asian region. So here's Korea, and then Vietnam is this S-shaped looking country at the bottom. just to help orient everyone so we're all on the same page. And then today's agenda, I will be presenting the lecture, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end. Okay, so in today's lecture, I will be discussing the relationship between the rise of the modern vernacular, the meaning of woman, and gender categories in Vietnam's early 20th century. Two key phenomena in Vietnam's early 20th century took place that will be relevant to today's investigation. The first phenomenon was the adoption of the Romanized alphabet as the modern Vietnamese national script. Quốc ngữ, first invented by Jesuit missionaries in 17th century, the vernacular was a departure from the prior predominant use of classical Chinese and Nom, the Vietnamese script, which employed Chinese ideographs to transcribe the Vietnamese language. There were a number of reasons for the rising popularity of the Romanized script, but surely the advent of modern print technology, together with the Romanized script's ease of learning, acquisition, and dissemination were significant factors. The second phenomenon relevant to today's investigation is the activity of translation that took place in much of East Asia. In the early 20th century, the collapse of dynastic kingdoms and the rise of modern state systems ushered in the process of modernization in much of East and Southeast Asia. This process of modernization also sparked an exhilarating period of linguistic translation that imbued older East Asian terms with new meanings in order to comprehend unfamiliar modern vocabulary emanating from the West. So in this slide here, we see the emergence of the modern Vietnamese vernacular written in the Romanized script. So the modern Romanized script is on the very left. You have the Chinese characters, and then you have the pinyin, and then the meaning in English to the right. And then as I mentioned, in the early 20th century, we see the collapse of dynastic systems in East Asia. So in China, the fall of the Qing Empire around 1911. In Vietnam, the Nguyen dynasty ruled that area throughout the 19th century, but was significantly weakened with the advent of French colonialism beginning in 1862. So for students, here's the map. You can see in the south, this is where the French first arrived, and then they moved northward, and then eventually claiming what is today Laos and Cambodia, and the three modern, the mainland Southeast Asian countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia would be known as French Indochina at the time. Okay, intellectuals in Vietnam, like in Republican China, and I presume a similar phenomenon happened in late 19th century Shochen Korea, were translating new terms and concepts of Western political theory. Some of these terms included modern abstractions that are now taken for granted, such as civilization, nation, culture, and society. So here in this slide, if you look, is an example of one of the concepts and terms that emerged in early 20th century Vietnam. The word is for society, and the term in Chinese is 社会. And this word appears in Vietnam around the early 20th century, 1900, 1902. And today it's taken for granted, right? We all know what a society is, but before the 20th century, the concept didn't exist. The word existed in French, société. It appeared in 1884, but it didn't mean society as we understand it. It meant like a guild or commercial group. And there are reasons for that. Some scholars believe that the reason this concept didn't exist before the 20th century in Vietnam is that the Confucian paradigm was not concerned with groups of people, with relationships between individuals. And so this is just an example of the neologistic revolution that was happening in the early 20th century. New concepts and terms were coming to East Asia and to Vietnam, and intellectuals had to translate these terms. Okay. In today's lecture, I would like to ask, what is the relationship between the modern vernacular, the categories of gender, and specifically the category of woman in Vietnam's early 20th century? Certainly, this was a period when one could observe a nascent modern Vietnamese women's movement. but how are we to understand the language in and through which Vietnamese use the conceptual categories of sex and gender? And in the context of this lecture, the terms for woman, what does the term woman mean during this period of Vietnam's modernity? It might be strange for some people to pose this kind of a question. For some people, it would seem obvious what the meaning of a man or woman is, and some historical scholarship on Vietnam takes this assumption for granted. But in the field of gender and sexuality studies, the terms and meanings for men and women depend on the historical and cultural context. So in this lecture, we will presuppose that the category of woman is historical, meaning it can change over time. Accordingly, I wish to ask after the continuity or rupture in the meaning of the category of woman in Vietnam's early 20th century, when we witnessed the simultaneous translation of Western concepts and the explosive growth of the modern Vietnamese vernacular, to what degree did the meaning of the category of woman become modernized in the midst of the efflorescence of translations of Western paradigms into Vietnamese? So, can you see the whole slide? Okay. So I would like to pose the question about the category of woman in the early 20th century in the same way that scholars have studied other concepts that emerge in East Asia and in Vietnam. In the Western paradigm, since the period of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, the category of woman for the first time became a category of sexual difference in which sex is associated with conceptions of distinct physiology and human nature. Prior to this, the Western tradition did not significantly account for female sexuality. And this is why so many feminist scholars in many different disciplines have criticized the Western tradition for this. In the East Asian tradition, beginning with the Song dynasty, that is 960 to 1279, there was the emergence of Phu Ke, which was women's medicine or gynecology. However, Chinese physicians of the time did not locate sexual difference in the corporeal flesh, but understood health problems as deriving from bodily processes such as blood depletion. It was only in the 19th century, in the Qing dynasty, in China, that there emerged the dominance of the Western model of sexual difference in the category of woman. Okay, so I just said that, explained the context here. In the Enlightenment in the West, it was only since the 18th century that the idea of sexual difference emerges. That might be difficult for some students to grasp, but the idea of sexual difference is historical, and it emerged in the West only since the Enlightenment. In the East Asian tradition, since the Song dynasty in China from 960 to 1279, there was what was called Phu Ke, right, which is women's medicine or gynecology. But we have to understand that at the time, Chinese physicians did not understand the meaning of woman as sexual difference. There was an entirely different medical model. It was only in the Qing dynasty in China in the 19th century that there emerged a paradigm of sexual difference. Okay. In this lecture, I will suggest that unlike elsewhere in East Asia, such as Republican China, in the case of Vietnam, pre-modern vocabularies predicated on sociocultural norms persisted far into the early decades of the 20th century. This period, I will suggest, still witnessed the discernible persistence of pre-modern Sino-Vietnamese sexual vocabularies and cosmologies. Here, it is worth clarifying what is meant by the term sex or gender. In conventional usage, sex typically denotes one's anatomical assignment at birth, gender, the cultural meanings associated with femininities and masculinities. While a growing body of scholarship has challenged any such easy distinction, insisting that sex may already be a form of gender, in this lecture, I shall provisionally use the designation sex/gender as a heuristic device to show their potential historical separation and or interconnectedness. Whether they are perceived as distinct, the same, or multiple, I follow where the historical evidence leads me to trace the vocabulary in Vietnamese documentary sources. Finally, the analysis that follows must of necessity bracket temporarily the issue of how meaning can dynamically change in pragmatic real-life contexts. The terms we shall examine can admittedly be used differently as they move from one context to another or within multiple frames of a single context. Nevertheless, the recuperation of the Vietnamese vocabulary for sex/gender in the early 20th century is a critical step in historicizing this critical concept. This lecture will be divided into two parts. First, I provide the regional context of sexual modernity in East Asia, and then I turn to the case of Vietnam, focusing specifically on the vocabulary used for the figure of the new woman. This is a global figure that also had early 20th century parallels in Korea, if I understand correctly, in order to show that unlike elsewhere in East Asia, the modern vocabulary of the Western paradigm had not yet become dominant in the Vietnamese case. Okay, so part one. Translating modernity, the concepts of sex/gender in early 20th century Asia. The process of linguistic modernization in East Asia arguably first began in Japan, beginning in the middle of the 19th century. Japanese modern reformers borrowed graphic loanwords from classical Chinese to translate new terms emanating from the West. Terms such as freedom, republican government, rights, society, and sex were some of the novel concepts that the reformers had to translate, in part by imbuing older classical Chinese terms with new meanings. These terms, in turn, migrated back to China, where they were employed by Chinese modernist reformers, such as Ling Qichao and Kang Yuwei, who translated Western political theory using literary Chinese. With respect to the modern idea of sex, Japanese modern reformers were exposed to Western sexological discourse in the late Meiji period, so from 1868 to 1912, relatively soon after they appeared in the West, especially in Germany. In translating the word sex, Japanese reformers employed sei, which in Chinese is the character called xing, xing. This latter term would, since the early 20th century in China, become today's Chinese term for sex/gender. Indeed, in China today, the meaning of xing as sex, the Vietnamese equivalent of which, as we shall see, is thin, has become so naturalized that some have forgotten that it has a history. Prior to the 20th century, the term xing meant one's natural character or instinct, where the natural refers to those characteristics that the heavens endow. In no way did xing refer to the contemporary notions of sex. In classical sources, such as the 12th century Confucian text, the Mencius, a collection of dialogues with the 4th century eponymous philosopher, the term xing, in opposition to the variable and animalistic needs for sustenance and procreation, referred instead to the unsexed, ungendered concept of innate human nature or essence. For Mencius and his followers, human nature is fundamentally good. It is akin to the idea of the virtuous Buddha nature eminent in all beings, unchanging, independent, and fundamental. Thus, as some scholars point out, the classical notion of xing stands in reverse relation to the vagaries of the contingent world of sex and desire. In other words, the classical meaning of xing bore little conceptual relation to the idea of sex. So here you see the Vietnamese word for it, and here's the Chinese word for it. And the classical meaning of the word is character, and then its modern meaning is sex or sexual disposition. Pre-modern China had other terms to convey the idea of sexual desire or activity. Some prominent terms include yin, se, rao, and yu. The term yin is associated with excess, such as man who is obsessed with sex, and thereby implies a moralistic warning. The term se refers to lust or temptation, captured, for instance, in the word for pornography or pornographic. Se-qing. The term rou denotes the flesh and is often counterposed to the idea of the spirit, ling. Finally, the term yu refers to carnal desire or lust, captured in synonymous combinations such as yin yu or se yu. Pre-modern China also had a multitude of colorful ways to convey the idea of sexual activity that were imbued with connotations at times metaphorical, historical, and literary. To describe sex between married couples, for example, classical Chinese employed discrete allusions such as the art of the bedchamber, poetic expressions such as a pair of mandarin ducks playing in the water, topple the male and female phoenixes, and cloud and rain, and references to the fairy maiden who could command the natural elements. Likewise, same-sex relations in classical Chinese also employed highly poetical expressions. These included cutting the sleeve in reference to Han Emperor Ai, who, upon seeing his male concubine asleep on the emperor's sleeve, ordered it to be cut so as to leave the bed without waking his beloved, or the expression sharing the peach in reference to a beautiful boy who offered a bitten peach to a duke. In essence, the terms in classical Chinese for sex in the sense of sexual activity were multiple and dense in poetic and historical illusions. In pre-modern Vietnam, euphemisms also existed to describe sexual desire and activity. This is most clear in the poetry of the late 18th century Vietnamese poetess Ho Xuân Phu. For example, in one of her poems titled "The Fan," I believe the Italian word il ventaglio. Il ventaglio, is that the Italian? Okay. So
you mean ventaglio?
Ventaglio?
Ventaglio, yes. Fan.
Ventaglio? Okay.
Yes.
So in one of the poems titled "The Fan," the Vietnamese poetess writes, one hole can fit just any number in, but fate's glued me to you since days long past. Stretch out three corners, crease remains the skin. Close up both sides, some flesh still jutting shows. I cool the hero's face when winds die off. I cap the gentleman's head as rains fall down. While coddling him, I'll ask the man in bed, are you pleased yet with my flip-flop inside? Now, it's not a stretch of the imagination to understand this poem to be more than its literal topic about fans, but it is an example of the euphemisms used in pre-modern Vietnam by a Vietnamese poetess, female poet. In China, by the late 1910s and early 1920s, however, the term for sex underwent a radical transformation. The colorful and multiple ways to refer to sex fell out of favor. Instead, the term "sing" now became the dominant term. This new modern term for sex, "sing," was not simply a substitute for the same concept. Instead, the modern meaning of "sing" was accompanied by the conjunction of sex and human nature. That is, sex became the anchorage point around which Chinese intellectuals and reformers intensified the pursuit of knowledge about the truth of human nature. Modern reformers, such as those of the May 4th New Culture movement from 1915 to approximately 1937, repudiated what they perceived was China's feudal past embodied in Confucian morality, and they considered backward, uncivilized, and sexually repressive. In embracing and translating the emergent sexual science circulating globally in Europe, the United States, and Japan, these modern reformers sought to liberate themselves and their compatriots from the shackles of a perceived repressive Chinese tradition. In short, the Chinese word for sex, "sing," which in its classical meaning bore no explicit relation to sex or desire, was now imbued with a new meaning to imply one's sexual disposition as a part of human nature. Mouse just froze. Give me 1 second. Okay, so part 2, the Vietnamese context, the case of the new woman. Now let us turn to the Vietnamese case. Okay. In the case of Vietnam, no prior study yet exists on the early 20th century vocabulary of sex and gender, much less its shifting historical usages and meanings. Yet the modern transformation of the vocabulary and meaning of sex was not an isolated event in Asia. Roca observes that the conceptual entwinement of sing as sex and human nature was not just a Sino-Japanese phenomenon. Rather, he suggests that we might fruitfully ask, in the global circulation of knowledge and language production, how and when other cultural contexts came to expel older vocabulary. For this reason, it is imperative that one pose a prior, even more basic question in asking, what were the terms for sex/gender in Vietnam's early 20th century? Are they the same as the contemporary one? If fundamental concepts such as sex and gender are not timeless but evolving phenomena, if even seemingly fundamental and intimate vocabularies of experience such as sex and gender are contingent artifacts of history, it is critical that we come to understand the historical character of the terms for sex and gender in the Vietnamese context before we can understand more profoundly what some scholars have called the nexus of new systems of knowledge, modalities of power, and forms of experience. I have argued elsewhere that, unlike in Republican China, in the Vietnamese case, the modern vocabulary meaning of sex and gender, that is the word tin in Vietnamese, the Vietnamese equivalent for sinh in Chinese, meaning sex, had not yet developed its modern sense to mean sexual disposition in the early 20th century. While I cannot reconstruct the argument in its entirety here, for the purposes of today's lecture, I would like to focus on a subset of the argument in focusing specifically on the terminology for the category of woman. The clearest piece of evidence showing the lack of traction of the modern Chinese term for sex in Vietnam is in the vocabulary to describe the new woman. In Vietnam's early 20th century, the Chinese neologism for a biological woman, nu sinh, never gained traction. The idea of woman in the sense of a sex subject became popularized in China beginning in and around the 1920s. Let's take a look. This new idea of woman was captured in the neologism nu sinh, a conjunction of the word for female, nu, and sex, sinh, where sex was now understood as a dimension of one's human nature. Since the Ming period in the 14th century, the most dominant Chinese term for woman was fu nu, a term that in no way marked feminine biology. Instead, this older term signified the collectivity of kinswoman in the semiotics of Confucian family doctrine. Conjoined by the kinship terms fu, meaning a married woman, and nu, unmarried woman, fu nu is defined by the Confucian protocol specific to the subject position. As a critical response to Confucianism, the neologism nu sinh, by contrast, emerged as a foundational womanhood beyond kin categories, and grounded in part by the authority of the then emergent sexual sciences and the common physiological ground that one shares with others outside the kinship group. In Vietnam's early 20th century, however, the dominant terms for woman remain largely confined to an older Vietnamese and Sino-Vietnamese vocabulary. Consider, for example, the terms that Vietnamese sources use to describe the iconoclastic figure of the new woman. This was a figure that departed from Confucian traditional mores in embracing modern westernized styles of dress and living habits. Now, if I understand correctly, the figure of the new woman was also appeared in colonial Korea in the early 20th century. Based on so you would have to fill me in on that since you know about Korea, but if I understand correctly, a similar phenomenon happened in Korea as well in the early 20th century. Yet the vocabulary that the Vietnamese employed to describe this modern new woman included terms such as tân nữ giới and phu nữ tân tiến. Regarding the first term for new woman, tân nữ giới, the word tân means new and nữ giới means female kind. Together, the term simply means a new female kind. The modern idea of sex nowhere appears, meaning tin or sinh, nowhere appears in the Vietnamese vocabulary to refer to the new woman. Regarding the second term for the new woman, phu nữ tân tiến, phu nữ means woman, and tân tiến means new or modern. Phu nữ is the Vietnamese equivalent of the Chinese phu nữ, the term that defines a woman on the basis of her subject position and relations within a Confucian kinship system. The term phu nữ also serves as a part of the title of one of the most significant forward-looking intellectual journals of this period, the New Woman's News. So here's sort of phu nữ tân văn. So phu nữ means woman, and then tân văn means new literature, right? So New Woman's News. And this is from 1929 to 1935. The circulation of this woman's journal. Thus, the name to describe the new woman is based on a word, Phu-nu, with pre-modern roots. The fact that the pre-modern Sino-Vietnamese term Phu-nu persisted far into the early decades of the 20th century, even to describe the iconoclastic figure of the new woman, suggests simultaneously the lack of dominance of the modern Western vocabulary and the enduring influence of the older Vietnamese one based on kinship ties. Finally, other terms Vietnamese sources employed during this time to refer to the new woman figure are Tân Phong Nữ Si and Gai Tân Phong. Okay, so Tân Phong Nữ Si and Gai Tân Phong, the first term derives from the name of an eponymous novel written by the Southern Vietnamese writer Ho Viu Chan. And this writer, he was born in 1884 and then he passed away in 1958. And the story is titled The New Educated Woman, Tân Phong Nữ Si. The story tells of a heroine named Tân Phong, meaning new wind or new style, who wishes to imitate her counterparts in Europe and America in opening an all-women's school, and who runs a Saigon newspaper titled The New Woman. The novel's title is a conjunction of the word new style, Tân Phong, female, new, and learned, si. The latter combination is listed in another journal edited by a Neo-Confucian, and it defines nữ sĩ as a young woman of letters or with education. The education in question is a modern Western style education. So here you see the word nữ sĩ, and that the character there, that's nữ and then sĩ. Together it means an educated woman. Finally, the other linguistic variation to refer to the new woman is Gai Tân Phong. In one of the scenes in the prior novel, a female journalist interviews a male medical doctor about the differences, if any, between a single and married woman. The female journalist introduces herself and her colleagues working at the paper, and here's the quotation in the novel. We are modern, educated females who have decided to band together to create a newspaper to understand how the modern woman has opened up paths of progress and equality for the female kind. The passage is striking in that it reveals another linguistic variation in referring to the new woman captured in the phrase modern educated females. In the Vietnamese vernacular, the word for female is gai, and the words for modern education is tân học. Tân means new and học means study or education. This linguistic variation in referring to the iconoclastic new woman as a modern educated woman refers in other Vietnamese print sources. The implication is that the new woman in question is one who has received a Western education and who has imbibed its modern values. In each of the prior Vietnamese variations of the term, referring to the iconoclastic figure of the new woman, the word tin or sing in Chinese, in the modern sense of sex, never appears. Instead, as we have observed, the Vietnamese sources continually employ older terms with pre-modern Vietnamese and Sino-Vietnamese roots. Ho Viu Chan's novel, published in 1937, is representative of the Vietnamese sources. In the prior scene in which the female journalist interviews a modern medical doctor about potential differences between a single and married woman, it is ironic that not once do any of the characters ever employ the modern word for sex or gender, particularly its modern Chinese equivalent captured in the word tin or sing. Indeed, the word tin in the modern sense of sex and gender is entirely absent in the novel. In Vietnam, unlike in China, therefore, the term nữ sinh, meaning the modern term for woman, in the sense of a sexed female subject, failed to gain substantial traction in the print public sphere of the early 20th century. So in conclusion, this talk first provided the regional context of sexual modernity in East Asia. In the case of Republican China in the early 20th century, the term for woman had acquired its modern meaning in the sense of sexual difference, that is, a group belonging to a distinct category of so-called biological human nature. Then in the second half, the talk turned to the case of Vietnam, focusing specifically on the vocabulary used for the figure of the new woman, a global figure that had early 20th century parallels, if I understand correctly, also in colonial Korea, in order to show that unlike elsewhere in East Asia, The modern vocabulary of the Western paradigm had not yet become dominant in the Vietnamese case. As I have suggested, the Vietnamese words for sex and gender, particularly the category of women, demonstrated pre-modern paradigms that persisted far into the early decades of the 20th century. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you to you, Richard, because this was quite illuminating. And yeah, indeed, I confirm that the same cultural revision and cultural modernization of the term is continuing, and in Korea too, in the same period, there is a long story of Shin Song, no? Shin Song, and even review, so journals. We also have journals with the title Shin-Yo-Ja or Shin-Yo-Song. So this is quite quite interesting, and it takes from Japan, but it also takes from China. And interesting to know, in Vietnam it was happening the same thing. So this was quite an Asian phenomenon. It would be really nice to go back also to the dear old Europe, and see if during the same time also in Europe this kind of debates. I know only a little bit about it, but that would be nice if some, Western expert, Western scholar on these matters would also give us his or her insights into the modernization of the contents, and maybe the influence of vernacular on such categories, which are also categories of, thinking in a new way. Any questions from the students? I think this was quite interesting. So maybe the students have, questions to ask to Professor Tran.
Or we can talk more about colonial Korea.
Well, well, actually, while you were talking about this colonial, no, not colonial, this new Vietnamese concepts. Well, Shin Song is totally a reading, a reading of the Sino-Korean and the Chinese, the classical Chinese influence. But there would be nice to see what kind of terminology becomes closer to the vernacular. So to pure Korean, for example, because we have always had this double layer of terms of Korean origin and terms of Chinese origin, and the terms of Chinese origin that they become prevalent due to the success and to the preciousness that the Chinese writing brings with itself. I really apologize for not opening my window, but opening my window means this, means looking at me upside down. So I prefer not to. There is something technical that I'm not able to solve. So
okay.
I prefer not to be in the picture.
So
This might seem unpleasant and not very 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 nice towards you, but please do not think that,
No
because
worries.
it is just a technical aspect.
So
Anyway,
in the early 20th century,
yes,
Korea, where
yes.
would what sources um, of Western influence? I know that if I understand correctly, a similar phenomenon was happening in Korea as well, right?
Yes, yes. Well, actually, I haven't studied this phenomenon deeply, but I know that there are two ways. So, Western sources translated into Chinese and then brought to Korea. So
I
this
see.
is one. So Western ideas coming from China, then Western ideas of modernization and new concepts and new poetry. I mean, I've tackled with the modernism through literature, and in some way it also comes from Japan, because also many students. So we have the Japanese annexation in 1910. The protectorate is in 1905. So we are basically in the same period with Vietnam, which I would really like to know more, and also China. Uh, so the Western countries have come to China and to Japan far so much earlier than in Korea. So Korea seems to be the last country of this East Asia region to get in touch with the Western countries in this period, because of course encounters with the West have already taken place also several centuries before. But the main changes connected to modernity are, of course, of this period. Um, and so, but there is also a direct contact, even if um, maybe slower, but for Korea, very significant around the end of the 19th century, when Westerners come to, especially from the states, so Protestants, they come, so missionaries, Protestant missionaries come to Korea and bring the new education. So they found schools for women, structured that they were totally absent in traditional Korea, in pre-modern Korea. The only education, the established education, the structured education was for men, and women were getting their education at home, if ever they were getting their education at home. And the education was, of course, only peripherically Confucian, and they were, say, educated in brackets, educated in being good daughters, good wives, and good mothers. So the household and recipes, and but some women, of course, even in the literary canon, we do have some women artists, women writers, women poets or poetess, this beautiful term that you mentioned before. In Italian, we have poetessa, so that's the same thing, the same term. We do have, but the literary canon is mainly built on male figures and male contributions. So this phase as well is quite important, and but this is not. I think that Korea is a bit more conservative in this field, and it was linked, very strongly linked, to Confucianism, to Neo-Confucianism, and to the strict separation of the sexes. But again, there should be some I don't know where, I don't remember, but I was reading about yes, next I think in no the next lecture we'll also see a difference in women's concepts and in women's education and in the relationship between women and men or girls and boys. Because, for example, there is one saying, but it's quite late, I think, 17th, 18th century, um, or 17th century probably, where it says, um, so after the age of 7, uh, girls and boys do not sit and do not stay in the same room.
Mhm.
So, and this is again, this is a hint at the you say genderization, the gendering of the concept and the term, the sex, um, and also the dangers of any whatsoever sexual relationship at that age. So at the age of 7, was felt, and that why it was also felt the need to prohibit the same presence, so the presence of 7-year-old boys and girls in the same room.
Mhm.
So this is part of really of a strict list of rules imposed by Confucianism
Yeah,
to Korean society.
in
So I
Korea,
think yeah,
yeah,
under some aspects it starts earlier, but certainly women. Oh, and then there are also some in literature, some very important writings also in the 19th century, so early in first half of the 19th century, when women write and they observe that it is really a pity that they were born women because they are not free to roam around the country. And this is particularly true in a case of travelogue by a woman, but it's written in classical Chinese, where she, well, whether it is true or not, we don't know, but I like to think that it's true. She dresses like a man and travels around the country. She is, of course, accompanied by, some servants. Of course, she has some servants, but I think she was a kiseng, so she was a kind of, entertaining courtesan. So and again, here we are speaking about women that were they enjoyed much more freedom than the noble women, so the daughters of noble families. Anyway, she writes such a beautiful travelogue, and I would really like to find the time to dedicate myself to that and to translate it because it's really, really beautiful.
Wow.
And I hope to do it one day soon. Yeah. So it's really worth being analyzed, and the contribution of the Vietnamese window on this, it's precious.
Yeah,
So
it's the
yeah,
more I think about it, I think there's so many parallels between Korea and Vietnam.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it makes sense why so many scholars are interested now in comparing the two.
Exactly,
Uh,
exactly. So maybe we should do some joint research on this on this subject. It's really, really important. So I don't know if the students have come up with, have some questions or not. That would be really important.
it's late in the
Ah,
day. It's late in the day,
Aurora,
and
Aurora. Ah, okay. Aurora, can you just hold on because I was reading something in the chat. Where is the chat room? I have a smaller. Where is the chat?
So Aurora made a comment.
Aurora Libanori. Aurora Libanori. She also asked a very, here it is. Yes, Aurora. Um, hmm. Where did you answer yes, Aurora? Can you hear me, or maybe you cannot? Okay, if the screen was visible. Okay, thank you. You always have, Aurora, you always have some questions during these lectures. Um, uh, just ask. Professor Tran is here, and he's available for all kinds of explanations.
Or it's also a very it's towards the end of the day in Venice, so
Yeah, no, I know. No, it's 4:30 here. It's 4:30 here, but probably they are in the library. They're studying, so maybe they
yeah.
cannot talk.
But it's also the end of the semester, so students are probably exhausted.
Oh, definitely. We too, Richard. Really, it has been quite a heavy semester.
Yeah. But if
Anyway,
but if you have any questions, I'm available afterward as
yeah,
well. You can just
yeah.
contact me by
Sure. Anyway, so Richard, if there are no questions, I would say that, we can free you. We can let you free. But it was really, really nice to meet you again, to be able to talk to you again and share some insights, some really, really interesting insights on this matter.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to be here again today, and thank you for having me.
No, you're most welcome. Please sign all the papers so we can, complete the administrative requirements as well. Send all that that our staff, our precious staff asks you, so that we can celebrate. And then don't forget, please, the your contribution. In view of what we have seen today, it's even more important that papers on this, in this realm of interdisciplinary and international analysis within Asia, and this comparison studies, comparative studies in Asia and also in Europe. The voice of Vietnam must be heard. So please contribute to, and then there will be 3 volumes. So basic as at least 3 volumes. One is in preparation, then the second one will be next year for this year's. So this matter will be, this article would be quite important in that publication, in the volume 2. And then for the volume 3, I want to, do some brainstorming with you all, because I was thinking of doing something between vernacularity and reading. So the access to reading, the change in habits, in reading habits, or in reading activities like, communal reading, for example, these kind of activities. Women during the Joseon dynasty, women were meeting. The women at court, for example, in the royal palace, they were reading together, or someone was reading and other women were also, were listening, and they were reading novels in the Onmun, in the vernacular, of course. And there were so many other things. So this is quite, reading might be the theme of next year, but I want to do some brainstorming. So,
Okay.
if you come up with other more challenging subjects, that is good too. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank
Richard,
you.
have a good time
Okay.
in the state of whatever, the Sunshine State.
Thank you again for having me. Take care,
Thank you
everyone.
to you. Bye bye, Richard. Bye. Thank you.